The heavy scent of fresh mud mixed with expensive French perfume when 16-year-old Grace Taylor was violently shoved to the ground, her pristine school uniform soaking in dark liquid, while 30 wealthy students stood in a perfect circle holding up their flashing smartphones to record her humiliation. The courtyard of Crestwood Academy erupted into a synchronized roar of cruel laughter that seemed to echo off the historic brick walls. But what none of these privileged teenagers realized was that this specific crying new girl was not just a helpless target, and within less than 48 hours, she would completely flip the script on every single one of them. To understand how a routine act of high school cruelty escalated into a full-scale federal crisis that brought billionaires to their knees, we have to look closely at the hidden gears of Crestwood Academy, an elite institution nestled on 12 acres of meticulously manicured Virginia land where annual tuition costs $42,000. This was a parallel universe where students did not just carry backpacks, they carried generational power, arriving every morning in chauffeured Range Rovers and customized sports cars, their family names permanently etched onto bronze plaques across the campus buildings. For decades, the unwritten rule of Crestwood was remarkably simple. The wealthy elite operated with absolute immunity, while the few scholarship or transfer students of color learned to remain completely invisible, blending into the background to survive. Grace Taylor, however, possessed a dangerous habit that the school's social elite completely miscalculated, because wherever she went, she carried a worn leather notebook with a thick elastic strap, a silent witness where she recorded every single word, face, and interaction she observed. She had lived in 4 different cities over the past 5 years, making her a master observer of human behavior capable of reading a room instantly while remaining entirely silent herself. On that fateful Tuesday morning in early September, her mother, Denise Taylor, had dropped her off a full block away from the grand stone entrance, not because their vehicle was inadequate, but because Denise understood the subtle art of avoiding unnecessary attention in a new environment. Denise had just accepted a highly sensitive, powerful position as the executive director of the Civil Rights Division at the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., a massive career move that came with a direct line to the Attorney General. Grace had explicitly chosen not to mention her mother's formidable profession on her school application during her private interviews, or to a single living soul walking the prestigious hallways of Crestwood Academy. Her mother had selected this specific academy because the glossy marketing brochures boasted an inclusive community with diverse perspectives and character-driven education promises that Grace immediately doubted the moment she stepped into the crowded student parking lot. As Grace walked through the heavy wrought iron front gates carrying nothing but her leather notebook, the crisp morning air smelled intensely of wet autumn leaves and costly designer cologne, while synchronized sprinklers hissed along the emerald lawns. She paused briefly near the entrance of the massive sports complex, reading a polished bronze sign that read, "Collins Athletic Center, donated generously by the Collins family," storing that specific name deep inside her memory, before continuing toward her first class. Exactly 7 minutes later, a gleaming white Range Rover pulled up directly to the main walkway, and out stepped Brittany Collins, the undisputed ruler of the school's brutal social hierarchy. Brittany carried herself like the crowded courtyard was her personal fashion runway, sporting a designer backpack, a flawless professional blowout, and dark sunglasses pushed casually onto her head despite the thick, overcast gray sky. Her billionaire father, Glenn Collins, was a ruthless real estate mogul, a prominent member of the Crestwood Board of Trustees, and the exact man who had personally funded the new science laboratories and possessed the principal's private cellular number. Brittany had inherited her father's immense financial confidence, but absolutely none of his corporate subtlety, masking her calculating cruelty behind a high-pitched, incredibly sweet voice that sounded harmless to teachers but left permanent emotional scars on her peers. She operated with a highly specific pattern of social destruction, having successfully driven out a biracial sophomore named Alyssa during the previous mid-semester through an intensive months-long cyberbullying and isolation campaign. Alyssa's devastated parents had attempted to file a formal complaint with Principal Donald Anderson, but after Glenn Collins made a single private late-night phone call to the administrator, the entire official investigation evaporated overnight. That was the immutable ecosystem of Crestwood Academy, where immense wealth dictated reality, structural power protected the abusers, and absolute silence was the mandatory price of admission for everyone else. Yet there was one critical detail about that historic stone courtyard that absolutely nobody paid attention to on that chaotic first day of high school, a detail that would change everything. Mounted securely on a heavy stone pillar directly above the main crowded walkway, just slightly above eye level, was a tiny modern security camera housed inside a dark glass dome. Its minuscule red light blinked quietly every few seconds, silently capturing every single interaction, every cruel smirk, every physical shove, and every tear that fell onto the dirty ground below. Grace Taylor noticed that exact camera lens within her very first 10 seconds of entering the academy gates, but she chose to say absolutely nothing about it, keeping the knowledge tucked away as she stepped into her first class. Her initial morning at the new school began with a suffocating wall of silence and concluded with systematic public humiliation across multiple classrooms. She deliberately selected the furthest back row in every single period, keeping her head low, taking meticulous notes, and refusing to volunteer information unless a teacher addressed her by name. In her advanced placement English literature class, a thin, stern woman, wearing reading glasses on a silver chain, instructed the new students to introduce themselves with one highly unique personal biographical fact. When Grace stood up and calmly stated that her family had recently relocated from the south side of Chicago, a wealthy boy in the second row instantly turned to his friend and whispered a derogatory comment about dangerous neighborhoods. The entire surrounding row dissolved into muffled, cruel laughter behind their hands, while the teacher either completely failed to hear the remark or intentionally chose to ignore it for the sake of convenience. Grace did not flinch. Instead, she opened her leather notebook, carefully wrote down the exact time, the student's physical description, and the precise quote underlining the words twice before closing the cover. By the start of third period, those venomous whispers had spread through the entire sophomore and junior classes, like wildfire transmitted not through the physical hallways, but through restricted group chats, self-deleting multimedia messages, and knowing glances. Grace felt that unique, agonizing brand of high school visibility where every single person is acutely aware of your presence, staring at you constantly, yet absolutely nobody looks you in the eyes or offers a seat. Then came the true test during the chaotic lunch rush, when the grand cafeteria, which resembled a high-end restaurant with white linen tablecloths and panoramic floor-to-ceiling glass windows filled with hungry teenagers. The rich aroma of roasted rosemary chicken and artisanal fresh bread drifted through the air as Grace collected her lunch tray and guided herself to an isolated empty table situated near the massive glass panes. Right in the dead center of the bustling dining room sat the undisputed throne table, a highly coveted location where Brittany Collins sat flanked by her two loyal lieutenants, Megan Davis and Haley Moore. The fourth chair at their table remained pointedly vacant, an intentional psychological power move designed to signal that absolutely no one was permitted to join their inner circle without an explicit royal invitation. Brittany spotted Grace within 30 seconds of her arrival, intentionally raising her voice to an audible pitch so that multiple surrounding tables could hear her every word. She loudly mocked Grace's appearance, referring to her as the charity case, laughing about how hilarious it was that the administration believed a diversity admission could ever truly fit into their elite culture. A girl sitting at an adjacent table looked visibly uncomfortable, staring down intensely at her porcelain plate in silence, while a boy behind Brittany simply smirked, refusing to interject. Grace did not look up from her food, but her hand began to tremble slightly, forcing her to press her pen down so hard against the paper that the dark blue ink bled directly through to the next 3 pages. She meticulously recorded the exact timestamps of the verbal harassment, the names of the primary instigators, and the names of every single student who chose to perform silence in that room. The lunch bell finally rang, and Grace disposed of her tray, walking out into the main corridor with her leather notebook held tightly against her chest like a protective shield, her jaw clenched so hard that her teeth physically ached. The narrow hallway outside the history department was where the psychological warfare escalated into physical intimidation as Grace tried to locate her assigned locker on the 2nd floor. The corridor smelled strongly of commercial floor polish and dry erase markers, and because most students were still lingering in the cafeteria, the space was nearly deserted. Suddenly, Brittany and Megan appeared from around a sharp corner, walking at an accelerated, aggressive pace that made a physical collision completely unavoidable to any outside observer. Brittany's shoulder struck Grace squarely in the chest with massive force, sending her textbooks, folders, and personal papers scattering wildly across the pristine tile floor. Brittany stopped dead in her tracks, looked down at the chaotic mess with a completely cold, humorless smile, and delivered a sarcastically hollow apology about failing to see her. She then suggested that Grace should begin wearing neon clothing so that people would not accidentally run over her while Megan held her smartphone low, secretly recording the entire interaction for their private group chat. Grace immediately dropped to her knees, calmly gathering her scattered documents one by one, her hands completely steady now because she had made a conscious internal decision to remain entirely still. She retrieved her notebook last, noting that it had fallen wide open to the exact page detailing the morning's harassment before tucking it securely back under her arm and standing up. Right at that exact second, Mr. Bradley, a senior member of the history department, walked into the hallway holding a steaming cup of coffee, witnessing the entire aftermath of the confrontation. He looked directly at Grace on the floor, saw the mocking expressions on the faces of Brittany and Megan, and chose to instantly look away, accelerating his pace down the hall. Grace watched his retreating blazer, calmly memorizing his face and the exact timestamp of his deliberate negligence, recording it mentally before the heavy afternoon rain began to fall outside. The torrential rain hammered violently against the reinforced glass windows of Crestwood Academy by the end of 6th period, transforming the pristine exterior grounds into a landscape of gray concrete and overflowing drainage ditches. When the final dismissal bell echoed through the school, the stone courtyard was completely soaked with deep puddles, forming rapidly in the low-lying garden beds adjacent to the primary exit walkway. Grace walked calmly toward the designated remote pickup area on the far western edge of the expansive campus, holding her cellular phone in one hand to coordinate with her mother, while her heavy backpack rested on her shoulder. As she navigated the narrowing stone path near the massive rose bushes, She realized her exit was completely obstructed by a deliberate, human-made triangle. Brittany Collins stood dead center on the walkway, while Megan Davis anchored the left flank and Haley Moore blocked the right, creating a tight physical perimeter that left Grace with absolutely nowhere to retreat. Brittany greeted her with a cheerful, terrifyingly friendly tone, stating that they simply wanted to welcome her to the academy properly, since their morning interaction had been so brief. Grace stopped completely, her eyes moving methodically between the three aggressive teenagers, experiencing that cold, sinking weight in the pit of her stomach that always accompanies imminent danger. She quietly expressed that she simply wished to walk past and go home, but Haley stepped forward aggressively, closing the physical gap on the right, while Megan shifted to lock the left. Brittany sneered, stepping into Grace's personal space until she was mere inches away, accusing her of walking around the academy like she owned the place when everyone knew she was nothing more than a statistical quota admission. She claimed that some guilty admissions committee had handed her a spot she did not earn, causing Grace's lower lip to tremble slightly as her eyes burned with hot tears, though she refused to break eye contact. Brittany smiled a slow, predatory smile, mocking Grace for crying, before placing both of her hands squarely onto Grace's shoulders and delivering a massive intentional shove. Grace stumbled backward blindly off the stone walkway, her shoes completely losing traction on the slick, rain-soaked earth as her balance shattered entirely. She went down violently into the deep, thick mud, her back hitting the wet ground first before her elbows and palms submerged completely into the freezing sludge. The dark mud splashed aggressively across her cream-colored school uniform, caking her neck, her skin, and her face, while her leather notebook landed face down in a deep puddle, instantly soaking through. The sound that escaped Grace's throat was not a loud scream, but a sharp, suffocating gasp, the kind of visceral reaction that gets trapped entirely between your lungs and your vocal cords. Approximately 20 sophomore students who were standing underneath the safety of the covered walkway witnessed the entire assault, some instantly raising their smartphones to capture the video, while others stood frozen in deep discomfort. Not a single person stepped forward to intervene, nor did a single voice call out for a teacher, as everyone silently waited for someone else to break the status quo. Brittany looked down at the mud-covered girl with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, declaring aloud that Grace had finally found the exact place where she truly belonged. A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the gathering crowd of onlookers, and Grace remained sitting in the freezing mud for 5 incredibly long, agonizing seconds as the heavy rain washed over her face. Then, defying every single expectation of the bullies who anticipated a broken, sobbing retreat, Grace Taylor began to stand up with absolute deliberation, mud dripping heavily from her tailored school blazer. She retrieved her ruined, waterlogged notebook from the puddle, took a deep breath, and wiped the thick mud from her eyes and cheeks, using one slow, steady stroke of her sleeve. She turned her head and looked directly into the eyes of Brittany Collins with an expression that contained absolutely no trace of fear, anger, or sadness. It was an expression of pure, unyielding memory. She was actively cataloging every single face in that crowd, every smartphone being held up, every individual laugh, and every single bystander who chose to do absolutely nothing to assist her. Without uttering a single word of protest, Grace turned around calmly and walked toward the outer gates, her back completely straight and her head held high despite the mud in her hair and shoes. Brittany watched her retreating figure with complete indifference while Megan casually saved the video file and Haley checked her makeup in a compact mirror, entirely oblivious to the small, blinking camera on the stone pillar above. None of them possessed the slightest inkling that within 45 minutes Grace would walk through her front door, hand her mother a complete list of names, and initiate a legal avalanche that no amount of Collins family money could ever stop. Grace arrived at her residence at exactly 4:17 in the afternoon, discovering her mother sitting at the kitchen island, surrounded by highly sensitive Department of Justice case files. Denise Taylor looked up from her laptop screen, and the air instantly left her lungs as she took in the sight of her daughter caked in dark, drying mud from head to toe. Her cherished leather notebook, a sentimental gift from her 13th birthday, was dripping foul brown water directly onto the polished hardwood floor of their entryway. Denise did not scream, nor did she rush over with a towel. Instead, she closed her laptop with a quiet click, removed her reading glasses, and calmly commanded her daughter to reveal everything. Grace sat directly in a kitchen chair, refusing to wash her face or change her clothes, first choosing to present the raw physical evidence of the assault while she narrated the entire day. She detailed the courtyard comments, the systematic lunchroom isolation, the intentional second-floor hallway, collision, Mr. Bradley's deliberate evasion, and the final physical assault in the rain. She opened her notebook to the few remaining dry pages, presenting the precise time-stamps, structural descriptions, and verbal quotes she had fastidiously recorded throughout her hours at the academy. Denise listened to the entire horrifying sequence without offering a single interruption, her face remaining entirely unreadable, though her knuckles pressed so hard against the table that the skin turned completely white. Once Grace finished her testimony, Denise asked a single tactical question regarding the presence of functional surveillance equipment in that specific courtyard, and Grace confirmed its existence. Denise immediately reached for her encrypted cellular device, completely bypassing the school administration, the principal's office, and the generic parent complaint hotline listed on the academy's public website. Instead, she placed a direct call to the chief of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Unit, a highly trusted former federal prosecutor with whom she had collaborated for years. The intense conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes, during which Denise clearly outlined a severe pattern of discriminatory conduct, identified the immediate need to preserve federal surveillance evidence, and established a timeline. When the call concluded, Denise looked at her daughter with fierce determination, instructing her to shower, consume a hot meal, and write down every single name she could remember. As Grace walked up the stairs, she softly inquired if her mother intended to notify the school administration, and Denise responded with a chillingly calm expression, stating that she would not do so just yet. The following morning, Denise initiated a telephone conversation with Principal Donald Anderson, executing the call not as an emotional grieving parent, but as an experienced senior federal attorney issuing a formal legal demand. She clearly identified herself by her legal title and explicitly requested an emergency meeting to address a severe physical assault that had transpired on school property. Anderson's voice shifted instantly from professional dismissiveness to a carefully managed, patronizing tone, attempting to minimize the incident by labeling it as routine high school emotional drama. He claimed that during the first week of a new semester, teenage emotions naturally ran high, suggesting that a simple, informal, guided conversation between the girls would resolve the misunderstanding entirely. Denise sharply corrected him, stating that her daughter had been physically assaulted in front of multiple student witnesses, and that functional security footage of the crime existed. Anderson paused for an incredibly long time before defensively asserting that Crestwood Academy possessed a long-standing culture of respect and that such incidents were rarely one-sided. Denise allowed a heavy, suffocating silence to stretch over the line for 3 full seconds before demanding a formal written copy of the institution's anti-discrimination and anti-bullying policies. Anderson promised that his executive assistant would transmit the documents immediately, but they never arrived because the moment he disconnected, he panicked and placed an urgent call to Glenn Collins. Principal Donald Anderson's hands shook as he dialed the private cellular number of Glenn Collins, informing the powerful billionaire board member that the new transfer student's mother was making significant legal noise regarding the courtyard incident. Glenn Collins was lounging behind his massive mahogany desk in his high-rise corporate office, enjoying a panoramic view of the Virginia skyline through floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He let out a loud, dismissive laugh into the receiver, completely incredulous that a new student could not handle a routine piece of high school teasing without involving her parents. He instructed Anderson to issue a generic statement promising an internal investigation and to simply let the matter dissolve quietly, reminding him who paid for the school's luxury renovations. When Anderson nervously mentioned that the mother had specifically cited the courtyard security cameras, a heavy beat of silence passed over the telephone line before Glenn responded coldly. He explicitly instructed the principal to ensure that the surveillance footage went through its standard 30-day retention cycle and vanished permanently, completely ignoring the legality of evidence preservation. Anderson expressed severe hesitation, but Glenn forcefully reminded him that he had personally funded the entire athletic complex and the parking lot renovations, stating flatly that his daughter would never receive a disciplinary mark. After disconnecting the call, Anderson collapsed into his leather chair and consumed 3 antacid tablets to calm his racing stomach, completely unaware of a critical legal reality. Denise Taylor had fully recorded the entire telephone conversation using an encrypted dual-line application operating fully within the legal boundaries of Virginia's one-party consent wiretapping statutes. At the academy, the institutional response to the assault was a wall of complete, suffocating silence, sending a clear message to Brittany Collins that she possessed absolute protection. Brittany interpreted this lack of consequences as a green light to rapidly escalate her targeted psychological warfare against Grace over the subsequent 72 hours. On Monday morning, Grace unlocked her locker only to discover a cruel, deeply racist caricature taped securely to the interior metal door drawn with brown marker and featuring the word "quota" scrawled in blood-red ink underneath. Grace's fingers trembled with intense emotion as she carefully peeled the offensive document from the metal, but instead of destroying it, she placed it inside a protective plastic sleeve and slid it into her notebook. On Tuesday afternoon, Grace discovered that her mandatory physical education uniform had been stolen from her locked locker during 4th period, leaving her to search for it desperately. She eventually located the garment stuffed deeply inside a filthy toilet bowl in the 2nd-floor girls' restroom, completely soaked and utterly unwearable. Before touching the ruined fabric, Grace utilized her phone to take multiple high-resolution photographs, ensuring the automated digital timestamp was clearly visible on the screen for future evidence. By Wednesday morning, a highly toxic digital screenshot began circulating rapidly through the massive junior class group chat, originating directly from Brittany's private phone. The message explicitly referred to Grace using an uncoded, highly offensive racial slur, followed by multiple laughing emojis, and a statement asserting that the administration should never have allowed her admission. 46 wealthy students viewed that highly illegal discriminatory message, yet not a single teenager utilized the school's anonymous reporting portal out of sheer terror of Brittany's immense social retaliation. However, one anonymous student whose identity Grace never uncovered felt a sudden stroke of conscience, captured a screenshot of the slur, and transmitted it to Grace via an untraceable social media account. Grace calmly downloaded the digital image, converted it into a hard file, and added it to her rapidly growing dossier of evidence before heading to her next class. On Thursday afternoon, the targeted harassment crossed a dangerous legal boundary inside the isolated second-floor restroom immediately following fifth period. Grace was calmly washing her hands at the porcelain sink, while the fluorescent lights above buzzed and flickered unevenly against the mirrors. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door swung open and Brittany Collins walked in, followed closely by Megan Davis, who immediately positioned her physical body directly against the door to block the exit. Brittany's face lacked her usual mocking smile. Instead, her features were hardened with genuine malice as she aggressively stepped into Grace's personal space. She snarled that she had discovered the telephone call Grace's mother had made to the principal, warning Grace that her billionaire father essentially owned the board of trustees and Anderson himself. She leaned in until her mouth was mere inches from Grace's ear, whispering a terrifying threat that if Grace chose to snitch again, her life would become a living nightmare until she fled the school. Megan stood by the door with her smartphone fully extended, actively recording the entire confrontation to use as blackmail material, completely oblivious to the massive trap they were walking into. Grace remained entirely motionless, her heart hammering violently against her ribs, though her face remained completely stoic as she stared directly ahead. Hanging quietly from her neck was a tiny, intricate silver pendant that her mother had fastened around her neck before her very first day of school. The piece of jewelry housed a military-grade built-in microphone with continuous loop digital recording capabilities and 50 hours of internal storage capturing every single whispered threat with crystalline audio clarity. Denise Taylor had absolutely no intention of sending her only daughter into a hostile elite environment without a sophisticated means of legal self-defense. The very next morning, the compromised school administration made its final corrupt move to protect the wealthy real estate mogul's daughter from disciplinary action. Glenn Collins called Anderson a second time, aggressively demanding that Grace be immediately removed from all of her core advanced placement classes to reduce social conflict. Anderson complied within 24 hours, completely altering Grace's academic schedule, disrupting her learning, and dropping her into random unfamiliar class sections mid-lesson. The innocent victim was being systematically punished and isolated by the school, while her wealthy abusers continued to walk the hallways with complete, unchallenged freedom. Denise immediately finalized a massive 14-page formal written complaint, attaching dozens of physical exhibits, digital screenshots, and certified audio transcripts, and dispatched it directly to the chair of the school board. The board chair, a wealthy corporate executive named Richard Caldwell, who played golf with Glenn Collins every single Saturday at an exclusive country club, issued a dismissive two-sentence response. He stated coldly that the complaint had been received and was currently under routine internal review, promising to follow up at an appropriate time that he never intended to define. But Denise Taylor was not wasting her valuable time attempting to build a standard school disciplinary case. She was meticulously constructing a massive federal civil rights lawsuit. She formally recused herself from the matter within the Department of Justice to avoid any potential conflict of interest, handing the comprehensive file to Patricia Wells, a ruthless federal prosecutor in the Educational Opportunities section. She simultaneously contacted the National Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, which immediately deployed a team of elite civil rights attorneys to her residence within 48 hours. Finally, she made a private call to a senior investigative journalist at the Washington Post who specialized in institutional corruption and racial equity in private education. She provided the seasoned reporter with a single name, a single school, and a devastating investigative question regarding how many minority complaints Crestwood had buried over the last decade. The reporter initiated an intensive investigation that very afternoon, completely undetected by the school board, the principal, or the arrogant Collins family, as the massive gears of federal justice began to grind. 2 entire weeks passed in absolute deceptive tranquility across the campus of Crestwood Academy, during which Brittany Collins continued to dominate the social hierarchy with complete arrogance. She walked the historic hallways under the assumption that her father's immense wealth made her completely untouchable, entirely unaware that a federal net was tightening around her daily life. Meanwhile, Grace Taylor continued to attend her newly assigned classes in complete silence, fastidiously maintaining her notebook and allowing the administrative traps to set themselves perfectly. Then came the highly anticipated annual Community Values Assembly, a massive, mandatory school-wide event held in the institution's grand historic auditorium every mid-September. The production was immense, with wealthy parents occupying the front rows, the stage podium heavily draped in the school's traditional embroidered crest, and a student string quartet playing classical music. The vast space smelled strongly of expensive wood polish, designer perfumes, and leather upholstery as hundreds of families settled into their reserved seats beneath the warm glow of massive crystal chandeliers. Glenn Collins sat prominently in the dead center of the front row, wearing a tailored navy blazer with the school's gold pin pinned to his lapel, confidently shaking hands with fellow board members. His daughter sat exactly 2 rows directly behind him, flanked by Megan and Haley, the 3 of them whispering loudly while scrolling mindlessly through their social media feeds. Principal Donald Anderson stepped up to the wooden podium at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, adjusting the microphone and clearing his throat before delivering a highly rehearsed, hypocritical speech. He loudly celebrated Crestwood's supposed unwavering commitment to character institutional excellence, and above all its deep dedication to total diversity and inclusion. He paused to allow a massive wave of applause to ripple through the auditorium, and Glenn Collins clapped the loudest from his front row seat, fully enjoying the hollow performance. Anderson continued for several minutes, tossing out empty buzzwords like integrity and belonging, like weightless balloons, completely oblivious to the fact that the rear double doors of the auditorium were swinging open. 2 individuals dressed in sharp, dark federal business suits walked calmly into the room, both carrying thick leather folders and displaying official gold federal credentials on lanyards. They did not seek out empty seats. Instead, they walked with absolute authority directly down the center aisle of the auditorium, causing the string quartet to stop playing mid-note. A massive murmur of confusion rippled through the rows of parents and students as Anderson's rehearsed smile froze completely on his face behind the podium. The female operative reached the base of the stage, turned toward the podium, and spoke in a clear, resonant voice that carried perfectly across the silent room without the aid of a microphone. She identified herself as Special Agent Diane Crawford of the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, accompanied by Special Agent Thomas Bennett. She announced to the stunned crowd that she was delivering an official federal notice that Crestwood Academy was under immediate federal investigation for systemic civil rights violations. She cited documented evidence of targeted racial harassment of students of color and a deliberate, corrupt institutional failure to enforce mandatory federal civil rights protections. She walked up the steps and placed the heavy legal document directly on the wooden podium in front of Anderson, whose hands began to tremble so violently he had to grip the sides of the structure to remain standing. Glenn Collins exploded out of his front row seat in pure fury, his face turning a deep crimson color as a massive vein began to pulse visibly on his temple. He boomed across the silent auditorium, demanding to know who had authorized such an outrageous disruption, loudly proclaiming his status as a powerful board member who had not been consulted. Agent Crawford turned slowly to face him, her expression remaining completely stoic, as she explained that the federal investigation had been triggered by a formal referral backed by undeniable physical evidence. She stated firmly that the protected evidence had been thoroughly reviewed and personally authorized for immediate action by the executive director of the Civil Rights Division itself. Glenn's jaw tightened into a rigid line as he glared at the agent, demanding to know the exact identity of this director, his voice dripping with intense corporate contempt. Right at that exact second, the rear auditorium doors opened for a final time, and Denise Taylor walked calmly into the silent room. She looked absolutely formidable in a tailored charcoal gray power suit, her official Department of Justice credentials resting clearly against her lapel as her high heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She did not accelerate her pace, nor did she grant a single glance to the furious Glenn Collins or the panicked principal standing on the stage. She walked directly down the center aisle, guided herself past the federal agents, and took a seat in an empty chair in the third row positioned directly next to her daughter. Grace looked at her mother, and for the very first time since she had been violently shoved into the mud, a brilliant, victorious smile illuminated her face. The entire auditorium erupted into total chaos as hundreds of parents began whispering frantically to one another, and students stood up in their seats to get a clear view of the scene. Smartphones were pulled out rapidly across every row, despite the school's strict prohibition against digital devices, while Brittany Collins stared at Grace from 2 rows away, the color completely draining from her face. Her lips parted in absolute horror as Megan gripped her arm in a panic, whispering frantically that the woman was Grace's biological mother. Agent Crawford raised her voice slightly to read the specific inventory of federal evidence that had already been legally secured and preserved by the FBI. She listed the complete unedited security camera footage from the courtyard stone pillar, multiple student-recorded videos of physical assault, and complete digital archives of the junior group chat slurs. Finally, she cited a crystalline audio recording captured inside the second-floor restroom on September 11th, documenting a direct verbal threat of violence and administrative coercion. Each separate item struck the silent auditorium like a massive shockwave, completely shattering the illusion of safety and immunity that the school's elite had hiding behind for decades. Anderson's hands lost all strength against the podium, while Glenn Collins reached into his blazer pocket, his fingers moving frantically across his phone screen to contact his corporate defense attorneys. But absolutely nobody in that chaotic room was looking at the billionaire anymore. Every single eye was fixed entirely on 16-year-old Grace Taylor, the girl they had laughed at. She sat perfectly composed beside her mother, her shoulders back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes completely clear, radiating an untouchable aura of absolute victory. The Community Values Assembly concluded in a state of absolute suffocating panic as wealthy parents clutched their expensive programs like shields and retreated toward the exits in a frantic hurry. Within 10 minutes of the dramatic public announcement, Principal Donald Anderson was aggressively escorted directly to his executive office by Special Agent Bennett for an immediate federal deposition. Through the frosted glass windows of the administrative wing, passing faculty members could clearly observe Anderson, sitting with his head buried deeply in his hands, while the federal agent systematically unrolled a massive array of incriminating documents across his desk. By noon, the Board of Trustees issued an emergency notice, placing Anderson on immediate indefinite administrative leave, effectively ending his long career at Crestwood in utter disgrace. The federal evidence file already contained the complete recording of his corrupt phone call with Glenn Collins, where he had explicitly advised the billionaire to let the surveillance footage expire. His legal fate was sealed, and the interim administration immediately turned its attention to the three primary student instigators of the targeted bullying campaign. Brittany Collins, Megan Davis, and Haley Moore were abruptly removed from their respective classrooms by security personnel before the lunch hour, one at a time, and escorted directly to the central office. They walked into the conference room to discover their wealthy parents already waiting for them, having rushed straight from the auditorium in a state of total uncoordinated panic. The air inside the room smelled strongly of stale office coffee, expensive leather briefcases, and pure, unadulterated terror, as the interim superintendent presented them with formal suspension notices. All three teenagers were immediately barred from entering school grounds, effective immediately, pending formal expulsion hearings under the federal civil rights investigation framework. Brittany's reaction was the loudest and most explosive as she stood up in the middle of the office and screamed at her father, begging him to utilize his immense financial power to make the problem disappear. Her voice cracked violently, not from a sense of genuine remorse, but from complete terrified disbelief that she was finally experiencing a real consequence that money could not buy. The protective golden shield that had covered her entire life was completely disintegrating before her eyes, and her father could only put his hand over his phone, telling her to remain silent while he argued with his legal team. Brittany collapsed back into her chair, her legs bouncing frantically with intense anxiety as she began to nervous pick at her cuticles until her fingers literally bled onto her lap. Megan Davis broke completely within the first 15 minutes of her federal interrogation, weeping hysterically and hyperventilating as she immediately turned on Brittany to save herself. She sobbed to the investigators that the entire campaign had been Brittany's explicit idea from the very beginning, claiming she only participated out of deep fear of becoming a social target herself. Haley Moore's parents completely bypassed the internal school discussions, arriving with a team of high-priced criminal defense attorneys who immediately began throwing out complex legal jargon regarding due process. They loudly argued that the immediate suspension was a massive, disproportionate rush to judgment, but not a single attorney in that room uttered the word innocent. Later that afternoon, a highly critical confrontation transpired in the main corridor as Grace Taylor walked calmly toward her mother's waiting vehicle to leave the campus for the day. Brittany spotted her through the open glass doors of the front office and completely broke protocol, rushing out into the hallway in front of dozens of watching students and administrators. Her face was heavily blotched from crying. Her expensive mascara was smudged extensively down her cheeks, and her voice carried a thin, desperate pitch, completely devoid of her usual confidence. She called out Grace's name, repeatedly begging her to stop walking, attempting to execute another performance of apology now that her entire future was hanging by a thread. She stammered out a series of frantic apologies, claiming that she never intended for the situation to escalate to this level, and dismissing her systematic cruelty as mere high school stupidity. Grace stopped walking, turned her body slowly, and looked at Brittany Collins with the exact same calm, unyielding expression she had displayed while sitting in the wet mud. She did not blink, she did not offer a comforting nod, and she completely refused to soften her features. Recognizing that a forced public apology designed solely to escape punishment possessed absolutely no moral value. Without delivering a single dramatic speech or uttering a single syllable, Grace turned around smoothly and continued walking toward the heavy front exit doors. The rhythmic sound of her leather shoes clicking against the clean tile floor echoed clearly through the silent hallway, growing gradually quieter, until she pushed through the glass doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. Brittany stood completely frozen in the center of the corridor, with her arms hanging limply at her sides, experiencing the profound realization that for the first time in her life, her words carried absolutely no currency. That evening, Richard Caldwell, the corrupt chair of the school board, who had attempted to bury Grace's initial 14-page complaint, submitted his immediate unconditional resignation from all institutional leadership positions. At exactly 6:47 in the evening, while hundreds of wealthy families across Northern Virginia sat down to dinner, the Washington Post published a massive front-page investigative article detailing the entire federal raid. The explosive headline sent shockwaves through the community, identifying the elite academy by name and explicitly naming the real estate mogul's daughter as the primary structural aggressor. By midnight, the digital article had been shared over 40,000 times across multiple global platforms, completely destroying the carefully manufactured reputation of Crestwood Academy forever. The explosive Washington Post article functioned as a massive legal match, and global social media networks quickly provided the volatile gasoline that transformed the scandal into a national cultural conversation. By the following morning, the story had been picked up for continuous coverage by major national networks, including CNN and NBC, occupying prime slots on every major digital education platform. Massive comment sections exploded with intense outrage, and highly visible social media hashtags trended globally before the Academy's front office staff could even arrive to answer the ringing telephones. But the viral public article was merely the glittering surface of the crisis. Underneath the media storm, the elite Department of Justice legal team was executing a massive, comprehensive structural audit. Agent Crawford's specialized unit successfully subpoenaed 10 full years of internal administrative records, secure emails, private disciplinary registries, board meeting minutes, and financial transactions tied directly to wealthy donors. What they uncovered, deep within the school's encrypted servers, was a highly calculated corporate machine explicitly engineered to protect institutional wealth by systematically silencing minority victims. Over the past decade, 14 separate formal complaints detailing severe racial harassment and discrimination had been filed by families of color, and every single file had been closed with zero administrative action. The underlying legal language utilized in the resolution files was completely identical across all 14 cases, featuring a copied and pasted phrase claiming the matter had been thoroughly investigated and resolved due to insufficient evidence. However, the private internal emails between Principal Anderson and the Board of Trustees revealed a terrifyingly corrupt reality of explicit collusion. In one incriminating email exchange from 3 years prior, Anderson explicitly wrote to a board member regarding a minority family threatening to go public with a bullying complaint, noting that Glenn Collins had promised to handle the matter financially if they closed the file immediately. In another digital exchange from 5 years ago, detailing an identical incident of hallway harassment, Anderson formally recommended transferring the victim to an entirely different academic section to minimize structural disruption to the school. The institutional pattern was entirely surgical. Every single time a student of color reported severe harassment, the school systematically isolated the reporter, altered their schedule, and subtly encouraged the family to seek other educational options. 3 separate minority families had completely withdrawn their children from Crestwood after being told by administrators that the elite institution simply was not a proper cultural fit for their children. The school's leadership had been highly careful never to utilize explicit racial language in their written documentation, but the overwhelming structural pattern spoke with absolute devastating clarity to federal prosecutors. At the very center of this decade-long criminal pattern sat Glenn Collins, whose financial fingerprints were heavily embedded across every single buried complaint, corrupted email exchange, and sudden school donation. The Department of Justice officially filed a massive federal civil rights lawsuit against Crestwood Academy in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, naming the Board of Trustees, and Glenn Collins individually as primary defendants. The federal court moved with unprecedented velocity, scheduling a comprehensive consent decree hearing within 6 weeks, forcing Glenn to hire the most expensive corporate defense firm in the state. His legal strategy was entirely predictable, revolving around total denial, public deflection, and extensive procedural delays, but the entire defense collapsed completely when the forgotten victims began to step forward. Alyssa, the biracial student who had been driven out the previous year, watched the national news coverage and immediately contacted Agent Crawford's direct federal hotline to offer her full cooperation. Her formal courtroom testimony was absolutely devastating as she detailed months of targeted psychological torture, explicit notes left in her locker, and the total refusal of Anderson to intervene. She revealed that her father had received a direct threatening corporate phone call from Glenn Collins himself, strongly suggesting that their family would face severe economic retaliation if they chose to pursue the matter legally. Following Alyssa's brave statement, the remaining 4 families who had been systematically silenced over the decade came forward in rapid succession, presenting a unified front that completely dismantled the defense. The final federal consent decree hearing convened inside a historic wood-paneled courtroom in Alexandria, where the space was packed to maximum capacity with national reporters, civil rights advocates, and wealthy parents. Grace Taylor calmly took the witness stand wearing a simple navy blouse, sitting with her hands folded neatly on the table before her as she prepared to address the federal judge. She did not shed a single tear, nor did she fidget under the intense glares of the defense attorneys. Instead, she spoke with absolute clarity, detailing every single hour of her experience at Crestwood. She then produced her historic mud-stained leather notebook, opening the warped, water-damaged pages to read aloud the exact entry she had written on the night of the assault. She read her own words, detailing how she had been shoved into the freezing dirt while a crowd of peers watched and did nothing, concluding her statement with a devastating critique of an elite system that forced a 16-year-old child to build a federal case simply to feel safe at school. Federal Judge Harold Brown removed his glasses, allowed a long silence to hold the courtroom, and delivered a scathing public ruling, placing Crestwood under a strict 5-year federal consent decree with total external oversight. Glenn Collins was formally permanently stripped of his position on the Board of Trustees, and the bronze plaque bearing his family name was violently unbolted from the athletic complex wall and removed in a cardboard box. Brittany Collins, Megan Davis, and Haley Moore were officially expelled from the academy, and Brittany faced a formal juvenile criminal petition resulting in 200 hours of mandatory community service and 18 months of intensive restorative justice counseling. 3 months following the historic federal victory, Grace Taylor made the conscious choice to officially transfer out of Crestwood Academy, refusing to spend another day walking hallways that required a federal court order to treat her with basic human dignity. She enrolled at Westfield High, a diverse public school situated 15 minutes from her house, where she immediately founded a highly successful student advocacy organization called The Record, dedicated to teaching young people how to systematically document institutional bullying. She still carries that exact mud-stained leather notebook in her backpack every single day, utilizing its warped, discolored pages as a permanent physical reminder that the most painful day of a person's life can ultimately become the exact catalyst they need to change the world.